Today on Inside the Issues, I speak with Olivier Blanchard on challenges facing the global economy. Okay. Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Inside the Issues, the CIGI online podcast. I'm David Welch, CIGI Chair of Global Security at the Balsillie School of International Affairs and Professor of Political Science at the University of Waterloo. And every week, I'm very happy to welcome into the studios here at the Center for International Governance Innovation a guest, a noted expert on some aspect of international public policy or global governance. And this week, I'm very happy to welcome Olivier Blanchard,
Pleasure.
who's the Economic Counsellor and Director of the Research Department at the International Monetary Fund in Washington. And welcome to CIGI.
Thank you.
You wrote very recently an important report on the outlook of the global economy, and that was a tough time to write a report on the outlook of the global economy because we're facing multiple different crises or potential crises. And so I'm grateful for you to come in and help us understand them a little bit better. Perhaps we might start with one that has been in the news a lot for more than a year now, and that's the euro debt crisis. What's your understanding of the state of play at the moment on how that is being handled? And are you optimistic at this point or pessimistic that the euro will hold together as a currency zone and weather this particular storm?
I'm reasonably hopeful, but there's a lot of work to be done. I think where we are is a result of two different things. The first one is even if there hadn't been the so-called looming crisis, the big crisis, many European countries were already on a very dangerous path. They basically had lost competitiveness, they had large current account deficits, but it was not catastrophic, it was just an illness. Then on top of this, what you have is the world crisis, the Lehman crisis, large decrease in growth, large increase in debt, and then things go from bad to worse. So they're combining the effects of these two things. And then you go across countries, and they all have, in effect, the same challenge, which is most of them have to reestablish some competitiveness that they have lost. The degree matters, some much less than others. And then they all have too high a level of debt. And again, some much more than the others. So, you know, in some cases it's going to be relatively easy, in some cases it's going to be very hard, but in general, the principle is the same. They have to reestablish competitiveness, which is tough because you have fixed exchange rates between them, right? So they really have to do it through an adjustment of prices and wages and that stuff. And then they have to do a fiscal adjustment. And again, if you start with a large gap to close, it's also very tough. So you have the most extreme cases, right? You have Greece, which is really there on its own. I mean, it's really much worse than elsewhere. But you know, you have the other European periphery countries, Spain, Italy, Portugal, Ireland, which are all fighting the same thing. And so what's happening, I think, is two things. I think all these countries are trying hard on their own to do the right thing. And the right thing is tough. I mean, it's structural reforms, fiscal adjustment, and so on, right? But in some cases, it's clear that they're not going to be able to make it on their own. And so they have programs, right? So this is Portugal, this is Greece. And in the case of Greece, which is the case in the news, the debt level is so high that they needed a break. So what happened this week is a bit of a break to help them get to where we hope they can get. So it's really a continuum from Greece to, I don't know, at the other end, maybe Finland or Germany, which are in decent shape. But it's all the same two palms, like competitiveness and fiscal.
Now there's a grand debate about whether the solution is stimulus or the solution is austerity in combination with some policy reforms. How does one decide which of these two kinds of medicines are the appropriate ones?
Typically the truth is in the middle. Right. That's a general principle in life, and that's true here, which is stimulus, I think, which would be an increase in debt levels from where they are, would be irresponsible. And because when you get to
for all countries,
for any country which is above 100%, 120, increasing that level of debt is incredibly dangerous. It just takes, the problem with these levels of debt, and I think we understand it better now because we've seen it a few times, is if investors think you're kind of okay, they're willing to lend to you at 1 or 2%, right? You can probably do it. If they wake up one morning and they say, these guys are not going to make it, we want a big risk premium, so we're only going to lend at 10%, they kill you. And so it's self-fulfilling, right? So when you're at those levels of debt, you don't want to stay there. I mean, it's really a danger zone. So there has to be fiscal consolidation. So I think the serious discussion is the speed, right? And it's clear that if you can do it slowly and be credible, it's much better, right? The problem is, can you do it slowly and be credible? And the other question is, if you want to do it slowly, do you have the financing to do it?
Right.
And so in many cases, either the financing wasn't there or the credibility was incredibly low. And so many of these countries went at it in a fairly strong way. Now, was it best? If they had been credible, if there had been more financing, probably could have been slower. But nobody was willing to finance them forever. So yes, it's tough. It's tough, but the direction is for sure. I mean, we have to have decreases in debt, at least relative to GDP. That is obvious.
I remember when people were reflecting on the euro at the outset, and the skeptics were saying it's puzzling to see how this could work when there's no strong central bank, when there's no equilibration mechanism for transfers between parts of the zone that perform differently, and when there's no orderly exit provision. For a while, the skeptics were silent because the growth hit all of those problems in Europe, but now it's almost as though they're having to figure out how to sort of back engineer these deficiencies in the original design of the currency zone.
Yeah, I mean, what the crisis has made clear is that the euro as a set of institutions is halfway. And either it goes back, which means exit, separation, and so on, or it goes forward, right? I think you said a weak central bank. I mean, the central bank has been fairly strong in all that. But the issue was more that there was no what we call fiscal union. But in effect, the notion that countries could be affected by shocks which were so large that even if they did everything right, there was not enough, they needed help. So there's no transfer mechanism in effect, right? And that's what's missing. So what they have to do in the future is find a way of helping each other when they're in serious trouble.
What role can the IMF play in that?
I think in having the conversation. I mean, we're not in charge of designing the fiscal union, but we just did some work on the fiscal union, which we have given them, which summarizes the experience of fiscal unions elsewhere. I think in many cases, I mean, the Euro members have been discovering things which had not happened in Europe, but had happened, in Asia or in Latin America, right? So what the IMF has is basically it has seen everything, right? And so in the building, they still at least one or two people who remember something which happened, right, 20 years ago in Argentina or 40 years ago in Japan. And so what I think where we're useful, and I think we've been useful throughout the Euro crisis, is as experts. They basically didn't know how to design a program. They wanted to help Greece alone, if you remember, at the very beginning. They didn't want the IMF, but they realized that it was not so much the money that we put much less than they did. But it was the fact that, programs is what we do, right? So they basically asked us to help. And I think we've helped along the way.
The importance of learning from history.
Yes.
We'll be back in a moment with Olivier Blanchard. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CIGI Online podcast. Look for us at cgionline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. So item number 2 on the global crisis agenda that's in the news these days is the U.S. fiscal cliff.
Right.
People are a little bit more optimistic now that Congress and the White House will find a way to avoid going over the cliff. How optimistic are you? And what do you think would actually happen if they didn't manage to avoid the automatic deadline of spending cuts?
So optimism or pessimism, you have to understand the political game, and I would not pretend to do it. I'm not sure anybody does it. There's a lot of posturing we don't know what people are willing to give up. It's clear that there's this obvious, there's agreement on the fact that the deficit has to be reduced. Mm-hmm. There's complete disagreement on the way it should be done. That's obvious. So whether they come to some compromise, I think there are two dimensions. Whether they come to some compromise, probably they will. Is it a compromise which really changes the outlook for the next 5-10 years? I think that's where they might try to repair things, but not really to put them in shape. If in the worst possible scenario, which I think has very low probability, it would be catastrophic. Because that goes back to the discussion we had on Europe, which is fiscal consolidation is needed. But in the short run, fiscal consolidation means you increase taxes and people spend less, or you decrease government spending and there's less demand, right? So it has an adverse effect on output. Mm-hmm. And if a full fiscal cliff happened, so we fell the whole way down, right? That would be a fiscal consolidation of between 4 and 5% of GDP, which is a gigantic number, mm-hmm. right? If you assume that this thing called the multiplier, which is the effect of fiscal consolidation on GDP, is 1, which is probably okay. That would be a decrease, other things equal, of 5% of GDP relative to whatever forecast we have.
What would be the aggregate global demand effect?
Oh, it would be major. I mean, again,
1%,
I think in this
2%.
case we think that growth in the US would be -2, something like this. Growth in the US -2 would have a fairly serious effect on Canada,
right.
But not only Canada,
true, yes.
right? It would have an effect on the world. It would probably create a world recession. Mm. I mean, the effect of the US on trade, on emerging markets, is very, very strong. So it would be catastrophic. Mm. But I think nobody expects this to happen. What may happen is either too little, they basically don't agree on much, or too much, but not that wide.
But from a macroeconomist's perspective, aren't there a few obvious solutions? The United States has an unusually low taxation rate for OECD countries. There would seem to be
right.
an enormous amount of room there.
Well,
but that's politically
if you're somebody who thinks that the level of taxation elsewhere is the right one, for example, if you live in Canada, or if you live in Europe, but as you know, there are people in the US who think that it's just fine. Right. It's the spending side which is not, right? And it's clear that there's a difference of opinion about the degree to which there should be a welfare state. A true difference of opinion, going beyond the hypocrisy of the statements. There are people who think that people should struggle and be on their own largely, and then there are people who are softer and want to help more.
Does the fact that the United States occupies such a central position in the global economy create a kind of a moral hazard for Washington policymakers, that the world can't afford to do anything but underwrite American irresponsibility?
It creates an externality, which I don't think they take into account at all. I mean, it's still a very insular debate.
Very ideological, it seems.
Well, yeah, ideological, but I think as a whole, it's, what will it do to the US and what happens to the rest of the world, not our problem. But the outcome could be so bad for the US that it will be avoided. In terms of scenarios, we don't know. It could be that, it takes a few months, there's a bit of a fall, there's some agreement, some interim agreement, and then there's more and more and more. And again, the lesson from Europe is when the markets send you the signal that they're not happy,
right,
somehow people find a way of doing something, right?
If the short-term solution is basically to postpone the fiscal cliff, what kind of effect would that have on the global economy?
It would not be very good, because what's missing, if I look at advanced countries in general, most of them have a path of fiscal consolidation, which you may find too tough or too soft, but it's there, and there's a plan, right? And Europe, intends to get to this 3% level fairly quickly. In the US, there is no such thing. There is enormous uncertainty. If I was just kicking the can, then the uncertainty would continue. And the uncertainty is probably very costly. We don't, one of the big issues is how uncertainty affects people, firms, households, consumers. And my sense is if it looked like we had just postponed the thing by 6 months and there was no hope that in 6 months would be much better, that would be costly. to the expansion in the US.
Is it your impression that the markets have actually priced in a solution? There doesn't seem to be a
No,
lot
they
of...
haven't.
They haven't priced it in
Maybe
yet.
one of the issues is they haven't put enough pressure on the politicians. But so far, no, we don't see much. Right? The yield curve, the long rates in the US are very low. The problem is that the rest of the world is not a very pleasant place either. So many investors say, well, it's not great, but we still go to the US and are willing to hold this stuff at very low rates. So there hasn't been the kind of market pressure that some European countries have experienced.
Very good. We'll be back again with Olivier Blanchard. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CIGI Online podcast. Look for us at cgionline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. So moving from Europe to the United States, now to China.
Okay.
Another one of the issues people flag as problematic is slowing Chinese growth. A lot of people say that's inevitable, that it's just not sustainable that Chinese have these 7 to 9% growth rates year over year indefinitely, but there's also the short-term potential for possibly fairly dramatic decline in Chinese growth. What's your interpretation of that problem, and are you worried about that, as worried about that, say, as the fiscal cliff in the United States?
So, in general, I'm not worried about China. Now, if things happen in the US, I'm worried about the whole world, including China. But leaving this aside, China used to go at 10%, and that just could not go on. It was not unhealthy, but I think there was just a point in time where it was possible. It's not. Now, what has happened, I think, is that the Chinese leadership has accepted that. So it used to be kind of a crime to talk about rates below 9% or 8%. And now I think they are happy with 8%. That's desirable, probably, so that's fine. The question is whether they get to 8 or they decrease more. So growth in China has been a bit under 8%. And the question, and some people say, well, hard landing, is it going to kind of fall much more than that? Our impression is no. If you look at why growth in China has been weaker, from a mechanical point of view, arithmetic point of view, it's exports. And that's really what is happening in advanced countries, which is affecting China. And there's a very strong effect on Chinese exports. When Europe is in bad shape, China suffers. Now, the assumption we had a year ago was that the Chinese leadership would respond to this by pushing up domestic demand to make up for the lost exports. Because they had done this earlier in the crisis, and they said they would. This has happened more slowly than we thought. So growth has been a bit weak. But our sense is they can push it if they need to. They will. And so we continue to basically be in a kind of 8% growth rate.
Has it been slower than you expected because the Chinese leaders have been unwilling to do it, or because they haven't found the right levers for it?
I think they have been unwilling to do it. They have concluded that they had gone at it a bit too much in the previous round, which was 2009. And so I think, nobody understands how the Chinese leadership actually thinks. But to the extent that we observe it, yes, it looks as if they basically did a bit less in terms of public investment, for example, than we thought they would do. Also, they have always said, it's also true that some of the things they want to do are hard. So it's one of the themes of the current 5-year plan, or even back, that consumption should increase. Consumption in China as a share of GDP is very, very small. But increasing consumption is actually hard, politically, because what happens is that people receive a very small share of the income, so you have to increase this, which means you have to deal with state firms. There are political issues. So it may be that they did less because some of it was actually harder to do politically. But I think they did less also because they wanted to do less. But they have the levers, and so that we're not terribly worried.
Would China be better off, do you think, if they moved more fully into full compliance with the more or less standard global norms of the economy, a fully floating exchange rate?
No, I think again, you don't go from, if you don't have, I think one of the lessons of a crisis, but of a crisis also, is you don't open everything if you're not ready to actually receive the customers. So if you don't have the financial infrastructure, financial regulation, the financial supervision, the training, the experience, opening your capital markets is a recipe for disaster. Now, you should aim to do this, but you don't want to do it overnight. And the Chinese approach is very much to try, let something happen, see if it works. The crossing the river in small steps, stone by stone. That's the approach, and I think that's a reasonable one. I mean,
how are they doing? Are they on a good timetable in that direction?
Well, I have no clue as to what their timetable is,
but based on what we observe in terms of what
yes, I mean they are opening some markets. There is now a bond market in China. People are freer to take money out of China. So yes, it's happening. They are using more and more price tools to control banks than quantity tools. So yes, it's happening. Could somebody dream that it should happen faster? Maybe, but I don't see this as a very major issue.
One of the recent games has been to try to read the tea leaves about the leadership change in Beijing. And is this a conservative or a progressive regime? Do you have a view on that, or is there a dominant view with the IMF on that?
I was in China last week discussing these issues, and I would say what I concluded is nobody that I know has any clue. I think the guys are playing it very close to the vest. The only minor insight I got was that although the world would like them to do it more through an increasing consumption, pushing consumption, they might be very tempted to do what they call green investment because they kind of know how to do these big investment projects. Green is actually quite popular because of the level of pollution. Urbanization would be a good thing. So my sense is that they may actually be pushing this quite strongly in the years to come.
Energy infrastructure spending.
Energy infrastructure spending, new technologies.
Very good. We'll be back again in a moment. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, the CIGI Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. So in our last few minutes, if it's all right with you, I'd be interested to pick your brains on the state of the governance of the global economy, and how do you think it's working well? How do you think it's not working so well? What do we need? What are the gaps? Are the solutions to current problems in sort of new institutions or reformed institutions, possibly fewer institutions? If you had your way, how would you design the prescription?
There are many dimensions. One is, did the countries get together to do the right thing during the crisis? So was there coordination? And I think the answer is very similar to the one we discussed already twice, which is when things are really bad, then things happen. So there's no question that in 2009, for example, there was a coordinated fiscal expansion. And my sense is that this was a very important thing to do. So there was a lot of coordination. It had to do with personalities. I mean, Gordon Brown was somebody who really wanted it to happen and made a difference. So, but since then, as we've seen, there are tensions. There are the usual tensions between emerging market countries, which want one thing, and Europe, which wants another one. Within Europe, you can see that there are tensions as well. So we have to be realistic there. Interests are going to conflict. Where there's a really big challenge, then progress will be made. Otherwise, it may not. In terms of the organization of the international monetary system or financial system, there's this eternal issue of should we have flexible exchange rates or should we have fixed exchange rates? I think the lesson from the crisis is you should probably have flexible exchange rates in most cases, unless there is really a good reason to have a common currency, but be careful. If you have floating exchange rates, you may want to actually try to slow down the flows of capital when they are too strong one way or the other. So these tools are useful. So I think again, it's not a very simple solution. It's not like everybody should float freely or everybody should be fixed. Again, it's in the middle. It depends on the country, but I think there's progress. Another big issue was what we've seen is the equivalent at the country level of bank runs, what we call sudden stops, right? And the other question is a country, for some reason, which is not necessarily its fault, sees capital go out very, very quickly. And clearly in this case, if it's not the fault of a country, even if it is, you probably want to help and provide liquidity. And so what has happened during the crisis is also the development at the IMF, for example, of liquidity provision windows, in effect. I think that's important. I think that's there to stay. Does this make for a completely harmonious, simple world system? No, it's much too difficult. In terms of institutions, I think the IMF, again, has proven useful, partly as an expert, partly by having many programs which countries which were kind of casualties of the Lehman crisis without being responsible for it.
It's been undergoing a certain amount of internal reform, the IMF. It's been reconfiguring itself.
There has been a lot of discussion and some action on quotas and composition of the board and so on.
Right.
These are,
is that helping,
in my view, largely symbolic. I mean, they show that emerging markets want more, but it's not because there is one more guy at the table or that the quota of country X is increased by 0.5%, that the world is different. The world is different and the result is this. Right. I think the world is different. I think the emerging market countries play a much more important role, and this will be increasingly so, right?
In 2009, the G20 seemed to play a very important role. Was that a flash in the pan, or is that a harbinger of something?
I think, there are these standing committees, and I think of the G20 a bit in this way, which is when times are quiet, G20 meetings are boring. So nobody really cares, right? When, again, there's a reason to do something, which was the case in 2009, then it was very useful to have it there. So it's one of these things I think you want to have in place. You have to realize that sometimes it's going to be bureaucratic, it's not going to do much, but if you need it, it's there. And it's a place to discuss issues. So yes, it's not 2009 in terms of a G20, and I don't know what will happen, but I can see an institution like this, but it could be what we call the IMFC at the IMF, which is basically the people, our members, playing the same role. I think these structures are useful. Again, they are only useful, or truly useful, when things are bad.
Right. Are there any interesting, potentially fruitful, big new ideas out there? For a while, there were some really interesting new ideas, many of which weren't taken up, like the Tobin tax, that sort of thing.
I think that enormous ideas I'm very skeptical of in general. I mean, you just have to do this and the world will be in good shape. I think we've learned that is rarely right. Has it led to a lot of rethinking about many issues, macroeconomic issues? Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Monetary policy will not be conducted the same way in the future as in the past. Fiscal policy, we understand very differently. So I think there's a lot of conceptual progress, which is a good thing given what happened. But, a great idea, let's all get together and do something together. I don't see it. I don't want it.
The art of muddling through.
Yeah, I think that's the reality of things.
Thank you very much for coming in and helping us understand these important issues better. And to the audience, thank you for joining us. And please join us again next week for another episode of Inside the Issues, the CIGI Online podcast. Look for us at cgionline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube.